They expected her to crumble. But when Karoline Leavitt pulled out the receipts and exposed their hypocrisy live on air, the entire panel unraveled. The setup. The invitation arrived 3 days before the broadcast, an unexpected email sitting at the top of Karoline's inbox. The subject line was direct: exclusive panel discussion, media accountability, and modern politics. A quick glance at the details confirmed what she already suspected. This wasn't an invitation, it was an ambush. Panel stacked with well-known liberal reporters, a discussion on accountability, a primetime slot on one of the biggest networks in the country. She knew exactly how this would play out. They'd pile on, talk over her, twist her words, and frame her as the outlier. She could have ignored it, moved on. But something about this setup felt different. They were underestimating her, and that was their first mistake. Game on, the Washington, D.C. studio hummed with quiet urgency as the countdown to live broadcast ticked away. Karoline adjusted the mic clipped to her blazer, catching her own reflection in a glossy monitor. The set was sleek, dark wood, polished surfaces, strategically placed lighting. Everything about it screamed manufactured neutrality, a carefully crafted illusion to appear balanced while steering the conversation in one direction. One by one, the panelists entered, seasoned media figures with decades of influence. They greeted her with polite coldness, the kind reserved for a guest they had no intention of treating fairly. At the center of it all sat Charles Whitman, the moderator, a network veteran, known for his controlled bias, subtle enough to seem credible, sharp enough to guide discussions toward the preferred narrative. He offered a smooth greeting as he took his seat. "Glad you could make it, Karoline. Looking forward to the discussion." "So, am I?" she replied, matching his tone. But she wasn't. The countdown hit 0. The cameras rolled. The familiar network jingle played. It was showtime. The trap is set. The debate began exactly as she expected. Charles framed the discussion as a question of journalistic integrity. Is media bias real, or is it just a convenient excuse for those who don't like the coverage they receive? One by one, the panelists spoke, each with carefully worded dismissals of bias concerns. "Media is about facts," one journalist insisted, "and facts don't have a political agenda." Nods of agreement followed. The usual script. Karoline listened, waiting, calculating. She knew better than to react too soon. Then, Charles turned to her. "Karoline, you've been vocal about media bias in the past. Some would argue that criticism of the press is just an attempt to undermine journalism itself. Do you think there's a real issue, or is this just political theater?" It was bait, an invitation to defend herself instead of discussing the real issue. She didn't take it. Instead, she leaned forward, hands loosely clasped on the table. "There is a real issue," she said evenly. "But it's not just about bias. It's about double standards." The energy in the room shifted, subtle but unmistakable. When journalists hold one side to an impossible level of scrutiny while excusing the other for the same behavior, that's not just bias. That's dishonesty. A flicker of discomfort crossed the panel's faces. A quick glance exchanged between two of them. They hadn't expected this. Receipts in hand, Charles cleared his throat, regaining composure. "Proof, you say?" Karoline nodded. "Yes." She reached for a neatly stacked pile of documents beside her, flipping the first page over with deliberate precision. This wasn't a stunt. She wasn't here to make vague claims that could be spun later. She came prepared. The camera zoomed in. As she continued, "In the last 6 months, major media outlets have run outrage-fueled coverage over certain political figures using strong rhetoric, calling it dangerous, divisive, even inciting violence." She set the paper down. Yet when their own preferred politicians use identical language, these same outlets run explainers on why it's taken out of context or misunderstood. Silence. She turned another page. "I have articles right here, written by this very network, where one party is accused of threatening democracy for questioning election results. She paused, then holding up another article. But here's another piece from the same network, defending election skepticism when it suited their narrative. The tension at the table was now palpable. The panel unravels, a tight-lipped panelist shifted in his seat. The moderator's practiced expression faltered. They weren't prepared for this. Charles attempted to steer the conversation away, but it was too late. The audience at home wasn't blind. They could see it. The hypocrisy. The selective outrage. The carefully controlled narratives crumbling in real time. Karoline had flipped the script, and the entire panel was falling apart. They thought Karoline Leavitt would fold, until she pulled out the receipts they expected her to crumble. When Karoline Leavitt stepped onto that panel, they assumed she'd struggle to hold her ground. But what they didn't expect? The moment she flipped the script, live on air, and exposed their hypocrisy for millions to see. It all started with an invitation. 3 days before the broadcast, an email landed in Karoline's inbox. The subject line was straightforward: exclusive panel. Discussion, media accountability and modern politics. She scanned the details. The panel was stacked with well-known liberal journalists. The topic, press integrity. The platform, a primetime slot on one of the country's biggest networks. Karoline immediately recognized it for what it was. Not a discussion, an ambush. She could have ignored it. But something about the setup intrigued her. They were underestimating her. That was their first mistake. So, she accepted. The setup. The Washington, D.C. studio buzzed with quiet urgency as the countdown to live broadcast ticked away. Karoline adjusted the mic clip to her blazer, catching her own reflection in a glossy monitor. The set was sleek, dark wood, strategic lighting, polished to give the illusion of neutrality. She wasn't fooled. One by one, the panelists arrived. A lineup of seasoned media figures greeting her with the kind of polite coldness reserved for a guest they had no intention of treating fairly. At the center of it all sat Charles Whitman, the moderator. A network veteran, controlled, polished, his bias sharp enough to steer the conversation without ever breaking character. "Karoline," he said smoothly, taking his seat. "Glad you could make it?" She matched his tone. Looking forward to the discussion. She wasn't. The countdown hit 0. The cameras rolled. The ambush begins. The segment opened predictably. Charles framed the discussion as a deep dive into journalistic integrity. "Is media bias real?" he asked, "or just an excuse for those unhappy with coverage?" One by one, the panelists spoke. Carefully curated responses. Dismissing bias as a myth. A talking point. "Media is about facts," one journalist, Jennifer Langston, stated. "Facts don't have a political agenda." The others nodded. Karoline listened, waiting, calculating. Then, Charles turned to her. "Karoline, you've been vocal about media bias in the past. Some argue that criticism of the press is just an attempt to undermine journalism itself. Do you think there's a real issue, or is this just political theater?" It was bait. An invitation. To defend herself instead of addressing the issue. She didn't take it. Instead, she leaned forward, hands loosely clasped on the table. "There's a real issue," she said evenly. "But it's not just about bias. It's about double standards." Silence. A flicker of tension. When journalists hold one side to an impossible level of scrutiny while excusing the other for the exact same behavior, that's not bias. That's dishonesty. The air shifted. Subtly. A glance exchanged between two panelists. A slight shift in posture. They hadn't expected her to come prepared. "I don't expect you to take my word for it," she added, reaching for a neatly stacked pile of papers beside her. "I brought proof. The receipts." The room stiffened. Mark Feldman, a senior political analyst, shifted in his seat, fingers laced together, as if searching for the right response. "Well, Karoline," he began, clearing his throat, "I think you're simplifying things quite a bit. Context matters. These situations aren't always one-to-one comparisons." She didn't blink. Context matters. Sure, she replied. But when the media decides which context is acceptable and which isn't, that's called narrative control. You're proving my point. Mark pressed his lips into a thin line. Jennifer jumped in. Karoline, let's be honest. Media outlets report facts. Some stories deserve more scrutiny than others based on impact. If one political figure is under fire more than another, maybe it's because their actions warranted it. Karoline exhaled sharply through her nose. Not quite a laugh, but close. So scrutiny is based on impact? She asked, flipping to another page. Because I also brought data. She held up a report. A study last year analyzed airtime spent on political controversies. When a conservative figure was accused of wrongdoing, unverified accusations, by the way, it dominated primetime war coverage for 2 weeks straight. She turned the page. But when nearly identical accusations surfaced against a liberal politician, a passing mention, 15 seconds, buried in the second half of a segment, she set the paper down. That's not prioritizing based on impact. That's selecting who gets scrutiny based on preference. The room tensed. Charles leaned back slightly in his chair, the mask of neutrality slipping just a bit. Jennifer wasn't done. All right, Karoline, she said, sitting up straighter. Let's test your argument. If bias is as bad as you claim, why do so many independent fact-checkers back up the stories you're criticizing? Karoline shook her head, amused. Fact-checkers, she echoed, letting the word settle before adding, you mean the same fact-checkers that mysteriously label one side's falsehoods as misleading or lacking context, while the other sides are called outright dangerous lies? Jennifer didn't respond. Karoline let the pause linger, just long enough for the audience at home to process it themselves. Charles finally spoke up. To be fair, Karoline, he said carefully, fact-checking organizations are independent entities. They don't take marching orders from the media. Karoline turned to him, eyes sharp. Then explain this. She picked up another sheet. Why did multiple major fact-checkers quietly update their verdicts after the political wind shifted, without acknowledging the change? She held the paper up. Why did headlines accusing someone of spreading debunked conspiracies suddenly get revised months later to say, actually new evidence has surfaced? Her voice was steady. If it was false, then it should be false now. If it's true now, then they misled the public before, so which one is it? The moderator blinked. The panelists stayed silent, because there was no clean, media-friendly answer to that question. Checkmate. The studio wasn't silent. Not exactly. There was the faint hum of the overhead lights, the quiet rustle of papers, the subtle shifts of bodies adjusting in their seats. But the usual rhythm, the seamless back and forth of like-minded voices, was gone. Charles cleared his throat. Again. It was the third time he'd done that. A subconscious attempt to regain control? All right, he said. Let's step back for a second. Karoline, you're making a broad argument about media bias. But let's be honest. Every outlet has some level of perspective. That's human nature. Isn't it unfair to paint an entire industry with one brush? She knew what he was doing, trying to reframe the argument, make her seem unreasonable. She didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. That's a fair question, she said. So let's make this simple. She reached down and picked up a tablet. Tapped. The screen. The studio's main monitor flickered to life behind her. Since we're talking about fairness, let's take a look at some real-time examples. The shift in the room was instant. Jennifer's eyes darted to the screen. Mark crossed his arms. Charles braced himself. And the real conversation was just getting started. The first clip played. A well-known anchor from this very network, visibly outraged over a conservative politician's inflammatory statement. This kind of rhetoric, he declared, is unacceptable and a direct threat to our democracy. The video. Cut to the next clip. This time, a liberal politician used the exact same rhetoric, months earlier. But instead of condemnation, the same anchor framed it as a strong and necessary response to dangerous extremism. The panelists knew where this was going now. So did the audience at home. And Karoline? She let it play out. The next segment showed a breaking news report slamming reckless election denialism. The host, with practiced concern, called it a dangerous attack on democracy. Cut to another video, same network, different narrative. This time, election denialism from the other side was framed as important questions being asked, with the host emphasizing that no democracy should operate without scrutiny. The hypocrisy wasn't just implied, it was staring them in the face. Charles leaned forward, his hands clasped, his jaw tight. His expression remained unreadable, but Karoline caught the quick flicker of his eyes toward the producers behind the cameras. They were scrambling. Mark cracked first. "Look, Karoline, you're cherry-picking," he said, exhaling sharply. "These are two different situations." "Context," Karoline repeated, cutting him off. "Right, because context only matters when it benefits." One side. Mark's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're being deliberately simplistic." Karoline raised an eyebrow. "You're right. Let's not be simplistic. Let's go deeper." She tapped the tablet again. Another clip played, a respected journalist passionately declaring that political violence is never justified. A moment later, a second clip, that same journalist months later saying, "Some protests may require escalation to be heard." Karoline set the tablet down. She didn't need to say anything. The footage spoke for itself. Jennifer was visibly uncomfortable now. Charles adjusted his tie. Mark's arms remained crossed, but his shoulders were noticeably tense. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to control the conversation, guide it, contain it. But Karoline had done something they hadn't expected. She had brought receipts. And more importantly, she had played them on their own network. Jennifer, ever the professional, made one last attempt. "Karoline, I think we're losing sight of the bigger picture here. The media isn't perfect, but it serves a crucial role. If you erode trust in journalism, what's left? Do we just abandon facts entirely?" Karoline let that hang in the air for a second before leaning forward. "Trust isn't something you demand," she said. "It's something you earn." She gestured toward the screen. "And right now, you haven't earned it." Jennifer blinked. No one else spoke. Because what could they say? But this wasn't over. Karoline was just getting started. The silence stretched, not the usual kind that comes in debates, where someone pauses just long enough to collect their thoughts before launching into a rehearsed response. This was different. A silence weighted by the realization that the usual tactics weren't working. And Karoline knew it. Charles finally spoke, his voice measured but slightly stiff. "All right, Karoline, you've made your point about double standards. But let's talk about responsibility. The media plays a role in holding people accountable. What happens when we don't scrutinize those in power? What's the alternative?" A classic pivot. Karoline recognized it instantly. Redirect the conversation away from hypocrisy, back toward justification. She exhaled, leaning back in her chair as if she had all the time in the world. "Accountability," she repeated, rolling the word over her tongue. "That's interesting." She reached for another sheet of paper. "Because when one political figure's misstep dominates headlines for 10 straight days under the guise of accountability, but an equally serious scandal involving someone on the other side is barely mentioned, that's not accountability." She looked at Mark. "That's protection." Mark let out a short, disbelieving scoff. "Come on, Karoline. The idea that there's some grand conspiracy to protect one side is ridiculous. If a story is newsworthy, it gets covered." Karoline turned to him, tilting her head slightly. "Is that so?" She tapped the tablet again. Another clip played. A major whistleblower story, ignored for months by mainstream outlets, dismissed as misinformation and unverified. Then months later, undeniable proof surfaced, and suddenly, the same outlets quietly reported on it. No apologies, no corrections, just a casual revision of history. Mark didn't respond. Karoline continued. "What about when major news organizations Spike stories that could hurt their preferred candidates, only to release them conveniently after an election? She leaned forward. Or when a network knowingly runs with a false narrative, refuses to correct it, and only acknowledges it years later, when it no longer matters. The silence that followed wasn't just tense, it was deafening. Jennifer interjected, her voice sharper now. That's speculation. There's no proof networks are deliberately spiking stories. Karoline raised an eyebrow. Really? She pulled out a leaked internal memo. A real one, verified, surfaced last year. It showed a major news outlet instructing journalists to downplay a specific scandal because it might feed the wrong narrative. She held it up. Jennifer froze. Charles shifted in his seat. Mark glanced toward the producers behind the cameras. He knew this wasn't looking good. Karoline let the moment breathe. You want to talk about responsibility? She said finally. Fine, let's talk about it. But responsibility doesn't just apply to politicians, it applies to you. When the media decides which facts the public deserves to know and which ones to ignore, you're not holding power accountable. You are the power. The tension in the room was palpable. For the first time in the discussion, Charles didn't try to pivot, because there was nowhere left to pivot to. Jennifer pressed her lips together. Mark was staring at the table. And Charles, the seasoned moderator who had steered countless debates before, looked like he wanted this segment to end. Karoline didn't smirk. Didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She had already won, but she wasn't done yet. The final blow was coming. The tension wasn't just simmering now, it was boiling. Even through the bright studio lights and carefully neutral expressions, Karoline saw it. The shifting of weight in their seats, the tightening of jaws. The way Charles gripped his pen a little harder than before. They had lost control of the conversation. And they knew it. Jennifer tried again, her voice carrying a sharper edge. All right, Karoline. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the media has made mistakes. That doesn't mean there's some coordinated effort to push an agenda. Journalists work hard to report the facts as accurately as possible. Karoline didn't hesitate. Then explain this. She reached for one last document, a list of high-profile retractions and corrections made by major news outlets over the past 5 years. She held it up for the cameras. Why is it, she asked, that every single one of these mistakes always seems to go in one direction? Why do retractions always come too late, after the damage is done? Why do fact checks apply one standard to one party and a completely different one to the other? Jennifer opened her mouth, then closed it. Mark was still staring at the table, arms crossed, but his silence was louder than any rebuttal. Charles tried one last time to steer things back under control. Karoline, media is a fast-moving industry. Sometimes in the rush to break news, errors happen. That's just the nature of journalism. Karoline didn't let him off the hook. Then why do the errors always serve the same narrative? Why do misinterpretations always cut one way? Why do headlines that turn out to be false get front-page coverage, but the corrections barely make a footnote? She let the weight of that hang. Then she delivered the final blow. You're not just reporters, she said, voice steady. You're narrative engineers. You don't inform the public. You curate their reality. The impact hit the room like a shockwave. Jennifer's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers curling slightly on the desk. Mark shifted in his chair, glancing toward the producers as if searching for an escape. But there was no escaping what had just happened. The audience at home saw it. The millions watching online would see it, because this wasn't just another panel discussion, this was a reckoning. Charles exhaled slowly, the faintest hint of defeat in his posture. He turned to the camera, forcing a tight smile. Well, I think we've had quite the discussion today. That was the signal. The producers had had enough. The segment was over. The cameras stopped rolling. The microphones clicked off. But the real fallout? That was just beginning. The illusion of composure cracked. Jennifer was the first to break, yanking off her earpiece with a sharp tug. Mark exhaled through his nose, dragging a hand down his face before muttering something under his breath. Charles leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as if he could press away the disaster that had just unfolded. Karoline remained seated, calm, unbothered. She had seen this reaction before. It always happened when people lost control of the narrative. A producer, a woman with a tight ponytail and an even tighter expression, strode onto the set, her headset clipped to her belt. "We're cutting that segment early for the online replays," she announced, her tone clipped. "We'll edit for clarity." Karoline almost laughed. Edit for clarity, code for damage control. She rose smoothly, adjusting her blazer. "You can cut whatever you want," she said evenly. "But the full broadcast is already out there, people saw it, and they'll keep seeing it." Jennifer turned sharply. "You act like you just exposed some grand conspiracy, Karoline, but all you did was play gotcha clips." Karoline met her gaze. If they weren't hypocritical, there wouldn't be any gotcha moments to clip. Jennifer's mouth opened, then shut. There was no comeback for that. Around them, a low murmur rippled through the crew. Some avoided eye contact. Others watched Karoline, not with disdain, but something closer to respect. Because deep down, they all knew the truth, and so did the millions who had just witnessed it in real time. By the time Karoline stepped outside the studio, her phone was blowing up. Missed calls, text notifications piling in so fast they froze her screen. The clip was already going viral. She scrolled through the flood of posts. She just destroyed the entire panel on live TV. This is unreal. They didn't even try to fight back. Watch them try to bury this. Save the video before it disappears. For violating guidelines. Karoline smirked. They were right to save it. Because within the hour, the predictable happened. The network's social media accounts posted only carefully edited clips, trimming the segment, cutting out the parts that hit too hard. News articles popped up, downplaying the moment, calling it an intense exchange instead of the humiliation it had been. But it didn't matter. The full, unedited version was already out there, thousands of times over. And once the internet grabs something, it doesn't let go. By evening, cable news was reacting. Some tried to spin it, others ignored it. But independent media? They were having a field day. A popular commentator streamed a reaction live. "Folks, this wasn't just a debate, this was a reckoning. She came in prepared. She shut them down. And they had nothing. No real answers, just excuses." A clipped segment racked up 1 million views in 2 hours. Karoline watched it unfold from her hotel room, sipping coffee as she flipped through channels. They thought this would be an easy win, a routine public shaming of a dissenting voice. They underestimated her, and now the truth was out there, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The next morning, the fallout hit full force. Karoline woke up to headlines spinning in every direction. Some called her ruthless. Others accused her of manipulating the conversation. A few tried to downplay it entirely, acting as if nothing significant had happened. But the view counts didn't lie. The unedited clip had surpassed 5 million views overnight. Independent commentators were dissecting it frame by frame, exposing every contradiction, every shift in body language, every moment the panelists realized they were losing control. And the network? They were in full damage control mode. Karoline flipped through channels, watching as panelists from the same network now debated how the real issue wasn't the debate itself, but the dangerous rise of misinformation. There it was. The DU classic move. When they can't deny what happened, they redirect. They don't address the substance. They attack the person who exposed it. Karoline sipped her coffee, unfazed. She had expected this. It was always the next step. Her phone buzzed. Another notification. A well-known independent journalist had just posted, "Breaking." Sources inside the network say producers were panicking after last night's segment. Some wanted to cut it from reruns entirely, but they knew it was too late. The internet had already taken over. Karoline smiled. That's why they were scrambling. They had spent years controlling narratives, but now they had lost control. The illusion of control had shattered. Later that day, her team forwarded an email from the network, a formal request for a follow-up segment. They wanted her back on air. The wording was careful, measured. They framed it as a continuation of the discussion, as if this was just a healthy exchange of ideas. But Karoline knew better. They weren't asking for a discussion. They were asking for a chance to clean up the mess. Her team debated it. Some thought she should go back, hold them accountable again. Others warned it was a trap. Karoline took a breath, considering she had already done what needed to be done. The truth was out there now, and if the network wanted damage control, they'd have to do it without her. She declined, because they needed her more than she needed them. By the end of the week, something bigger was happening. Politicians and media figures were being asked on live TV about what had unfolded that night. Do you think Karoline Leavitt was right? Should the media be held to the same standards it applies to others? Some dodged, some fumbled through weak defenses. But one thing was clear. The moment wasn't dying down. The conversation had shifted, not because the media allowed it, but because the people demanded it, and that was the part they never saw coming. A week had passed, but the ripple effect was still spreading. What started as a single segment had turned into a national conversation, not just about media bias, but about trust, about who controls the narrative, about what happens when the people they claim to inform stop believing them. Karoline had expected backlash. She didn't expect what came next. A major news outlet, not the one she had debated on, but a competitor, ran an editorial. The headline, "Has the media lost its grip on the public?" It was carefully worded, still defensive, still reluctant to admit fault. But the fact that they were even asking the question, that was a shift. The very people who had spent years dismissing accusations of bias were suddenly acknowledging that trust was eroding, because they didn't have a choice. The numbers were in. Surveys showed public confidence in mainstream media had hit an all-time low. Viewership on alternative platforms was surging. More people were tuning into independent analysts than ever before. Karoline knew what that meant. The network she had humiliated wasn't just worried about one bad night. They were worried about what came next. Because if enough people wake up, if enough people see through the illusion, the whole system collapses. Despite the media frenzy, Karoline kept her distance. She turned down follow-up invitations, ignored smear pieces trying to paint her as dangerous or reckless. She didn't need to defend herself. The truth was already doing the work for her. One night, as she scrolled through messages from supporters, a thought crossed her mind. They'll never learn. The media had a chance to reflect, to acknowledge their own hypocrisy, to rebuild trust. But instead they were doubling down, blaming the public for falling for misinformation, insisting that alternative voices were the real danger. They were proving her right again. But Karoline wasn't angry. She was prepared. Because the more they tried to silence the truth, the louder it became. And if they thought this was the end, they hadn't been paying attention, because this was just the beginning. If you're tired of being told what to think, if you're done letting corporate media decide what's true and what's not, share this video. Let people see for themselves, because the moment we stop questioning, they win. And if there's one thing they fear the most, it's a public that refuses to be controlled.